A long time ago, the Israelites lived in Egypt. They had settled there during a time of famine because of Joseph, an Israelite who had risen to power in Egypt. However, many generations later, a new Pharaoh came to power who did not know Joseph. This Pharaoh was afraid of the Israelites because they were growing in number and strength. He feared that they might join Egypt's enemies in a time of war and leave the country. To prevent this, he enslaved the Israelites and forced them to do hard labor. They built cities, worked in the fields, and endured harsh conditions under the Egyptian taskmasters. Despite their suffering, the Israelites continued to grow in number. Pharaoh, in an attempt to control their population, ordered that every newborn Hebrew boy be thrown into the Nile River. It was a time of great distress and sorrow for the Israelites. During this dark period, a Hebrew woman from the tribe of Levi gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a fine child and decided to hide him for 3 months. When she could no longer hide him, she placed him in a basket coated with pitch and set it among the reeds along the banks of the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter came down to the river to bathe and saw the basket among the reeds. She sent her servant to get it and, upon opening it, saw the baby crying. She felt compassion for him and decided to adopt him, knowing he was one of the Hebrew children. She named him Moses, which means "he drawn out of the water." Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace and was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. However, he never forgot his Hebrew roots. One day, when Moses was grown, he went out to see his own people and observed their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Angered by this, Moses looked around and, seeing no one, killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. The next day, he saw 2 Hebrews fighting and tried to intervene. One of them asked, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Realizing that his deed was known, Moses fled from Egypt to the land of Midian to escape Pharaoh's wrath. In Midian, Moses sat by a well, where he encountered the 7 daughters of the priest of Midian. They had come to draw water for their father's flock, but some shepherds tried to drive them away. Moses stood up and helped them, then drew water for their flock. The daughters returned home and told their father, Reuel, also known as Jethro, about the Egyptian who had helped them. Jethro invited Moses to stay with them, and in time, Moses married Zipporah, one of Jethro's daughters. They had 2 sons, Gershom and Eleazar. Years passed, and the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out for help. God heard their cries and remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked upon the Israelites and was concerned about them. Meanwhile, Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, near Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire but was not consumed. Curious, he went closer to investigate. God called to him from within the bush, saying, Moses, Moses." Moses replied, Here I am." God instructed him to take off his sandals, for the place where he was standing was holy ground. God then revealed that he had seen the misery of his people in Egypt and had heard their cries. He had come down to rescue them and bring them to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. God told Moses that he would be the one to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses was hesitant and asked, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God reassured him, saying, I will be with you. God also told Moses to tell the Israelites that he had sent him. When Moses expressed doubt that the people would believe him, God gave him signs to perform, turning his staff into a snake, making his hand leprous and then restoring it, and turning water from the Nile into blood. Despite these signs, Moses still hesitated, saying he was not eloquent and slow of speech. God assured him that he would help him speak and teach him what to say, but Moses pleaded for someone else to be sent. God, angry with Moses' reluctance, said that his brother Aaron could speak well and would assist him. Aaron would speak to the people on Moses' behalf, and Moses would perform the signs God had given him. Moses returned to Egypt with his family, and along the way, Aaron met him. Together, they gathered the elders of Israel and conveyed God's message. Aaron spoke to the people, and Moses performed the signs. The Israelites believed and bowed down in worship, realizing that God had heard their cries and was concerned about their suffering. Moses and Aaron then went to Pharaoh and delivered God's message. "Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh replied, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Instead of freeing them, Pharaoh increased their workload, making their lives even more difficult. The Israelites blamed Moses and Aaron for their increased suffering. Moses, distressed, cried out to God, asking why he had brought this trouble upon the people. God reassured Moses that Pharaoh would eventually let the Israelites go because of his mighty hand. God renewed his promise to bring the Israelites out of Egypt and reminded Moses of the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh again, but he continued to refuse to let the Israelites go. God then began to send plagues upon Egypt to demonstrate his power and compel Pharaoh to release his people. The first plague turned the waters of the Nile into blood, killing the fish and making the water undrinkable. Despite this, Pharaoh's heart remained hard. The second plague brought a swarm of frogs, which covered the land and entered people's homes. Pharaoh begged Moses to pray to God to remove the frogs, promising to let the Israelites go. However, once the frogs were gone, Pharaoh hardened his heart again. Next, God sent a plague of gnats, which covered the people and animals. This was followed by a plague of flies, which filled the houses and ruined the land. Despite the severity of these plagues, Pharaoh still refused to let the Israelites go. God then sent a plague that killed all the livestock of the Egyptians, but spared the livestock of the Israelites. Even this did not change Pharaoh's mind. The sixth plague caused painful boils to break out on the Egyptians and their animals. Despite his suffering, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. The seventh plague brought a devastating hailstorm, destroying crops, animals, and people caught in the open. Pharaoh admitted his sin and asked Moses to pray for the storm to stop, promising to release the Israelites. But once the storm ceased, Pharaoh's heart was hardened again. The eighth plague brought locusts, which devoured everything left after the hailstorm. Pharaoh pleaded for relief, but after the locusts were gone, he again refused to let the Israelites go. The ninth plague brought total darkness over Egypt for 3 days. Pharaoh summoned Moses and told him to leave, but not with their flocks and herds. Moses insisted that they needed their animals for sacrifices. Pharaoh, angry, told Moses to leave and never return. Finally, God announced the 10th and most severe plague, the death of the firstborn in every Egyptian family. God instructed the Israelites to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb so that the angel of death would pass over their homes. The Israelites followed God's instructions, and that night, the angel of death struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, including Pharaoh's own son. There was loud wailing throughout Egypt, but the Israelites were spared. Pharaoh, devastated, summoned Moses and Aaron during the night and told them to leave Egypt with all the Israelites and their possessions. The Egyptians urged the Israelites to leave quickly, fearing further calamity. The Israelites left in haste, taking with them unleavened bread and the treasures given to them by the Egyptians. This marked the beginning of their journey to freedom, known as the Exodus. God led the Israelites through the desert by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. When they reached the Red Sea, Pharaoh changed his mind and pursued them with his army. The Israelites were terrified, but Moses reassured them that God would deliver them. God instructed Moses to stretch out his hand over the sea, and he parted the waters, creating a dry path for the Israelites to cross. They walked through the sea on dry ground, with walls of water on their right and left. When the Egyptians pursued them into the sea, God caused the waters to return to their place, drowning Pharaoh and his army. The Israelites saw the great power of the Lord, and they feared him and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. They celebrated their deliverance with songs of praise and thanksgiving, led by Moses and his sister, Miriam. The journey through the wilderness was long and challenging. The Israelites often grumbled and complained about the lack of food and water. But God provided for them, sending manna from heaven and quail for meat, and bringing water from a rock. He also gave them the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, establishing a covenant with them and setting laws to guide their lives. Despite their hardships, the Israelites continued to experience God's provision and guidance. He led them with signs and wonders, showing his presence.